He had already walked past her.
Wait, tell me.
Just another street vendor on a crowded afternoon. A worn-out umbrella, a quiet voice, nothing that demanded attention. Fresh fruit, please, sir. He didn't stop. Didn't even look. But then. A small boy ran up, grabbed her hand, and said, "Mom. I'm hungry." And something about that voice made him turn. Slowly. Carefully. Like his body already knew, before his mind could catch up. Because the moment he saw that child's face, his entire world stopped. Same eyes. Same jaw. Same everything. And just like that, 7 years of silence came crashing back in a single breath. Before we go any further, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. We read every single one, and it genuinely means a lot to know who's in this community with us. And if you're new here and this kind of storytelling moves you, click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Cassidy Monroe. She was 24 years old, raised in a small town called Harlan, Kentucky, one of those places where the mountains curve around you like walls and the roads all look the same in the rain. She grew up in a house where the heat sometimes didn't work in January and where dinner was whatever her mother could stretch until Friday. But Cassidy never complained. Not once. She had that rare kind of spirit that doesn't need much to find beauty. She could make a simple Tuesday feel like something worth remembering. She was the kind of woman who remembered your coffee order, who kept birthday cards in a shoebox under her bed, who would sit with you in silence if that was what you needed. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't loud. But she was the sort of person who left a mark on everyone she ever met, even if they didn't realize it until she was gone. By the time she was 22, Cassidy had moved 200 miles away from Harlan, not out of ambition exactly, but out of necessity. Her mother had developed a chronic kidney condition, and the medical bills had started to pile up in a way that their small-town income couldn't absorb. So Cassidy packed what she could fit into one duffel bag and moved to Louisville, where a cousin had said there was work. She found a job at a mid-scale hotel, working the front desk during the morning shift, then picking up evening hours at a nearby coffee shop 3 nights a week. She sent money home every 2 weeks without fail. She kept a small notebook where she tracked every dollar, what came in, what went out, what was left. There was almost never much left. Her apartment was a studio on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and someone else's cooking. But she made it hers. She hung a few photos. She bought a small plant from a gas station for $2 and somehow kept it alive for 2 years. She was doing what millions of quiet, hard-working American women do every single day, surviving, not because it was glamorous, but because they have no other choice. And then she met Marcus Webb. Marcus was 31, originally from Cincinnati, and he had what people in Louisville called new money energy, the kind of confidence that comes not from old wealth but from having built something yourself and knowing it. He ran a small but growing logistics consulting firm, drove a dark blue Audi, and wore the kind of clothing that looked simple but wasn't cheap. He came into the coffee shop on a Thursday evening in October, sat at the counter, and ordered a black coffee with exactly 1 sugar. He came back the next Thursday. And the one after that. He always sat at the same spot, and he always talked to Cassidy, not in a pushy way, not in the way some men talk to women who are on the clock and can't walk away. He just talked. He asked her questions and actually listened to the answers. He laughed at things that were genuinely funny. He told her about his work, about a bad investment he'd made 3 years earlier and how he'd rebuilt from it, about how he'd grown up with his grandmother in Cincinnati after his parents separated. He was real with her in a way that felt unfamiliar, because most people Cassidy met in that coffee shop treated her like furniture, pleasant enough when they needed something, invisible the rest of the time. By November, they were texting. By December, he had taken her to dinner at a restaurant she would never have walked into on her own, the kind of place where the menus don't have prices and the hostess greets you by name if you've been before. Cassidy wore a green dress she had bought secondhand and pressed carefully. She was nervous. But Marcus looked at her across that table like she was the most interesting person in the room, and something in her chest loosened in a way it hadn't in a very long time. He drove her home that night and walked her to the door and did not ask to come in. She thought about that small, deliberate kindness for days. By February, they were together. Fully, quietly, officially together. They spent Sunday mornings at farmers' markets and late Friday nights watching movies on his couch with takeout boxes spread across the coffee table. He met her once a month when she had a day off and drove her to visit her mother in Harlan, a 4-hour round trip he never once complained about. Her mother, Patricia, liked him immediately, said he had steady eyes, which was her way of saying she trusted him. Marcus took that compliment seriously. Cassidy could see it in his face. What she could not see, and what would take months to understand, were the things Marcus kept just slightly out of reach. He never introduced her to his business partners, even when she came up in conversation. When she asked about his family beyond his grandmother, he was vague in a way that was hard to pin down, not dishonest exactly, just carefully selective. There were weekends when he would go quiet for 36 or 48 hours, responding to her texts with one-line answers that said nothing. When she asked about those stretches, he blamed work, described project deadlines and difficult clients, and he was always so calm and reasonable about it that she felt embarrassed for asking. So she stopped asking. She was afraid, in the quiet part of herself she didn't like to examine, that asking too many questions would remind him of the distance between their worlds, that she was a girl from Harlan who sent money home and kept a $2 gas station plant on her windowsill, and he was someone who moved through a world she had only ever seen from the outside. She didn't want to be the reason he looked at her differently. So she gave him the benefit of every doubt she had. It was on a Tuesday in early May, 8 months into their relationship, when Cassidy sat on the edge of her bathtub with a pregnancy test in her hand and watched the 2 lines appear. She sat there for a long time. She looked at the plant on her kitchen windowsill through the open bathroom door. She thought about her mother. She thought about the notebook where she tracked every dollar. And then she thought about Marcus, his steady hands, the way he laughed, the look on his face when her mother called him a man with steady eyes. And she thought, we can do this. She believed that. She genuinely believed it. She told him that same evening. He had come over after work, and she had made dinner, nothing elaborate, just pasta and a salad, the kind of meal that felt normal and grounded, the kind she always made when she wanted something to feel okay. She sat across from him at her small kitchen table and told him. She watched his face carefully the whole time she was talking. And the face she saw was not the one she had learned to love over 8 months. There was a stillness that came over Marcus Webb that Cassidy had never seen before, not calm, not thoughtful, but something colder. Like a door closing. He set down his fork. He looked at the table for a moment. And then he looked at her and said, very quietly, I need some time to think about this. She nodded. She told herself that was reasonable. She told herself he was just processing. He left that night without finishing dinner. Over the next 2 weeks, the texting slowed. The calls became shorter. He cancelled 2 plans without explanation and rescheduled once and then cancelled again. And Cassidy, who had spent her entire life being the person who gave more than she received, who stayed calm when others panicked, who pressed her green dress and walked into restaurants she couldn't afford and sent money home on time every single month, Cassidy began to feel something she had spent years teaching herself not to feel. Fear. Not of being alone. She had been alone before and survived it. But the fear of having believed in something that wasn't what she thought it was. 3 weeks after she told him, Marcus Webb came to her apartment on a Sunday afternoon. He sat on the edge of her couch, not leaning back the way he usually did, but perched forward with his elbows on his knees. And he told her, in the measured, careful tone of a man who had rehearsed, that he did not think he was in the right place to be a father. That his business was at a critical point. That he had things he needed to work through. He said he would support her financially, in whatever decision she made, and the way he said it, the flatness of it, the businesslike quality, made Cassidy feel like she was being managed rather than spoken to. She asked him directly, "Are you saying you want me to end the pregnancy?" He didn't say yes. But he didn't say no. He said it would be easier. He said it was probably the more realistic option. He said he could connect her with someone who could help. Cassidy looked at him for a long moment. She looked at her hands. She thought about every conversation they had ever had, every Sunday at the farmer's market, every drive to Harlan, every dinner where he had looked at her like she was the most interesting person in the room. And she understood, in a way that settled in her chest like cold water, that those things had been real to her and something less than real to him. That she had loved a version of Marcus Webb that may never have fully existed. She told him she was keeping the baby. She told him she would not be asking him for anything. She told him she would appreciate it if he left. He left. He texted her twice over the following week, vague, short messages that felt like they were written more for his own peace of mind than for hers. She didn't respond to either of them. And then he stopped. His number, which she had memorized without trying, went completely silent. He had not asked about the baby since. He had not asked about her health. He had not asked anything at all. Marcus Webb, who had driven 4 hours round-trip to Harlan to meet her mother, who had ordered the same black coffee with 1 sugar every Thursday for 6 weeks just to talk to her, had stepped out of Cassidy Monroe's life with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else. And Cassidy was left alone in a studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like old carpet, with a $2 plant on her windowsill, a notebook full of budgets that no longer added up, and a child growing inside her who deserved a world she was terrified she couldn't provide. But she was still here. That is the thing about women like Cassidy Monroe, and there are so many of them, far more than the world acknowledges. They do not collapse. They do not have the luxury of collapsing. They recalibrate. They make new lists. They call their mothers and cry for exactly as long as they allow themselves to cry, and then they hang up and start figuring out the next step. Cassidy told her mother about the pregnancy over the phone on a Wednesday night, and Patricia Monroe, with her damaged kidneys and her 4-hour-away life, said the same thing she had always said whenever the ground fell out from under her daughter: "You're still standing, baby. That means you're still winning." Cassidy held on to that. She held on to it through every prenatal appointment she attended alone, scheduling them around her hotel shifts and coffee shop hours. She held on to it when she had to tell her manager she was pregnant and negotiate the terms of her maternity leave, which was short and unpaid. She held on to it when she moved to a slightly larger apartment, not nicer, just slightly less cramped, in a neighborhood that was affordable and where her neighbor, an older woman named Ruth who had raised 3 children largely by herself, brought her soup 3 times during the pregnancy without ever being asked. Human beings, Cassidy discovered, could be extraordinary when you gave them the chance. Her son was born on a January morning, quiet and alert, with a full head of dark hair and a way of looking at the world that, from the very first hours of his life, felt startlingly focused. She named him Elijah James Monroe. She lay in the hospital bed with him on her chest and looked at the ceiling and cried, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of loving something so completely that it reorganized every part of you. She took a photo of his small hand wrapped around her finger and sent it to her mother and to Ruth and to no one else. There was no one else to send it to. She went back to work 6 weeks later. Ruth watched Elijah during her hotel shifts 3 days a week, and Cassidy paid her what she could, which was not enough, and Ruth never once made her feel it. The coffee shop hours she had to give up, the body simply wouldn't hold 2 jobs and a nursing infant, which meant the budget tightened in ways that kept her awake some nights running numbers in her head. She applied for and received assistance with food and with Elijah's medical coverage, and she was grateful for it in the way that people are grateful for things that should not have to exist but do because the world is set up in ways that punish the wrong people for the wrong reasons. She did not think about Marcus often. She did not allow herself to. She had learned, and this was hard-earned wisdom, the kind that costs something, that grieving a person who chose to leave is valid, but living inside that grief is a form of giving them what they took. So she thought about Elijah instead. She thought about his laugh, which arrived at 3 months and was the most astonishing sound she had ever heard. She thought about the way he grabbed her thumb. She thought about Ruth calling him the professor because of the serious way he observed everything around him. She built her days around him with the same careful precision she had always applied to her budget notebook. Every dollar tracked. Every hour accounted for. Every small joy noted. Elijah turned 1. Then 2. By the time he was 3, he was talking in full sentences and had strong opinions about his socks. He did not like socks with seams. This was non-negotiable. He called Ruth Auntie Roo and made her a Mother's Day card with a handprint in red paint that she framed and hung next to her front door. He asked Cassidy questions constantly, about birds and clouds and why traffic lights were 3 different colors, and she answered every single one as thoroughly as she could, because she had decided very early that Elijah Monroe was going to understand that curiosity was never an inconvenience. He did not ask about his father until he was 4 years old. They were at the park on a Saturday afternoon, the kind of warm October day that Louisville does beautifully when it tries, and Elijah was on the swings asking Cassidy to push him higher. A man arrived with a small girl, his daughter, clearly, from the matching expressions on their faces, and he pushed her on the swing next to Elijah's, and the 2 children immediately began competing over who could swing higher. And Elijah, mid-arc, turned to Cassidy and said, "Where's my daddy?" Cassidy kept pushing. She took a breath. She said, very calmly, "You and I are our own family, Eli. Some families look different from others. Ours is you and me and Auntie Roo, and that's a really good family." Elijah thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "Okay," and went back to competing with the girl on the next swing. But Cassidy's hands shook a little as she pushed him. Because she knew that answer would work for now, and it would not work forever, and one day she would have to find words for a truth that she still hadn't fully made peace with herself. 3 years passed. Elijah turned 7 in January, and Cassidy marked the birthday quietly and meaningfully, a small party at the apartment with Ruth and 2 boys from his class and a chocolate cake she had learned to make from a YouTube video she had watched 5 times before she got it right. She had, by this point, taken on a new role at the hotel, not management exactly, but a coordinator position that came with a modest salary increase and, for the first time, health insurance that covered both of them. She had stopped tracking every dollar quite so anxiously, though she still tracked most of them. Old habits. She had started, very slowly, rebuilding a life that had room in it for something other than survival. She had not heard a single word from Marcus Webb in 7 years. And then, on a Thursday afternoon in March, she was crossing the street outside the hotel after her shift, Elijah beside her, his hand in hers, wearing a red jacket that he had also had strong opinions about purchasing, and she heard a voice behind her say her name. Cassidy. She stopped. She turned around slowly, because something in the sound of it, the specific way her name sat in that voice, had already told her before she saw his face. Marcus Webb was standing on the sidewalk. He was 40 now, or close to it. He was still well-dressed. He still had the same steady-handed quality she had once found so reassuring. But there was something in his expression that she had never seen before, an unsteadiness. A look that was not confident or rehearsed or managed. He was looking at her, and then at Elijah, and then back at her, and the calculation on his face was unmistakable. He knew. Elijah looked up at the man on the sidewalk with his serious, curious eyes. He tightened his grip on Cassidy's hand, not from fear exactly, but from the instinct children have when they sense that something is happening that the adults around them have not yet named. "Hi," Elijah said, with the straightforwardness of a 7-year-old who has been told that polite greetings are non-negotiable. Marcus looked like he had been struck by something. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this story, because what happens next is the part that will stay with you. "Cassidy," Marcus said again. His voice was different now. Lower. The practiced quality was completely gone. I didn't know. I mean, I knew you were, but I didn't know he was. You knew I was pregnant, Cassidy said. Her voice was even. She had spent 7 years getting to even. You knew exactly what you were leaving. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Elijah again, at the dark hair, at the shape of his jaw, at the serious brown eyes, and Cassidy could see him doing the arithmetic that she had done alone in a hospital room 7 years ago. I want to explain, he said. I'm sure you do, she said. It was not cruel. It was not cold. It was something quieter than both of those things. It was the voice of a woman who had survived being left, had learned to need only what she could build herself, and had arrived at a place where his explanation, whatever it contained, was no longer something she required. She had stopped needing his story a long time ago. She had written her own. She pulled Elijah gently along beside her. We have somewhere to be, Marcus. He took a step forward. Please, just 10 minutes. Can I have 10 minutes? Cassidy stopped. She looked at him. She thought about Patricia Monroe, who was still alive and fighting and had finally, after years of the medical bills, been put on a kidney transplant list the previous spring. She thought about Ruth, who called Elijah the professor, and had his handprint painting by her door. She thought about every single night she had spent in that studio apartment with the old carpet smell, running numbers in her head, choosing between fear and function and always, choosing function. She looked at Elijah, who was watching the exchange with his characteristic quiet attentiveness, taking in every detail the way he always did. Then she looked at Marcus Webb. Elijah, she said, will you stand right here with me for 1 minute? I need to say something to this gentleman. Okay, said Elijah. She looked at Marcus. She said, I don't know what your life has looked like for the past 7 years. I don't know what you've told yourself about that Sunday afternoon when you sat on the edge of my couch and suggested I make a more realistic decision. But I want you to understand something very clearly. She paused. Not for dramatic effect, just because she needed to find the words that were honest rather than theatrical. You did not choose him. And because you didn't, someone else had to choose him twice as hard. So if you've come here expecting some kind of opening, some door I've left unlocked for you all this time, I need you to know that door was closed a long time ago. Not out of bitterness. I made peace with all of this. But because Elijah deserves a father who chose him before he was convenient. And that is not what you were. Marcus Webb, the man who had built a successful business from a bad investment, who drove a dark blue Audi and had steady hands and calibrated eyes, Marcus Webb stood on a Louisville sidewalk and had nothing to say. She took Elijah's hand and they walked. They crossed the street and turned right at the corner, and neither of them said anything for a half a block. Then Elijah looked up at her and said, was that man someone you knew before? A long time ago, she said. Did he make you sad? He asked. She looked down at him, at the red jacket he had insisted on, at the serious face that somehow made her feel steady every single time she saw it. Not anymore, she said. And she meant it with everything she had. That is the part of this story that does not make the news. The part that no one photographs or films or documents in any official way. The 7 years of quiet, grinding, love-driven survival. The birthday cakes made from YouTube videos watched 5 times. The $2 plants kept alive on windowsills. The neighbor who brings soup without being asked. The child who calls her Auntie Roo and makes handprint paintings. These are the real monuments of a life rebuilt from abandonment, small, ordinary, and completely extraordinary. Marcus Webb, according to people who knew him at the time, attempted to reach out twice more after that afternoon, once through a mutual acquaintance who had Cassidy's email address, and once through a letter sent to the hotel where she worked. She responded to neither. She had a child to raise and a transplant list to pray over and a life that had been built without his participation and did not require it now. The letter sat in her desk drawer for a while, unopened. Eventually she threw it away without reading it. She said later, to Ruth, over coffee, after Elijah had gone to bed, that she had imagined reading it so many times in those first terrible months after he left that by the time the actual letter arrived, she had already heard everything it could possibly say. She didn't need the real version. She had already given herself the closure. Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. How many people spend years waiting for an apology that never comes, waiting for the person who hurt them to give them permission to move on? And how many people, like Cassidy Monroe, quietly stop waiting and simply begin? And ask yourself honestly, if you had been in her position, 24 years old, alone, carrying a child whose father had just told you that keeping it was the less realistic option, what would you have done? How long would you have waited? How long would it have taken you to close that door yourself? Because Cassidy did not close it in anger. She did not close it in triumph. She closed it the way you close the window on a rainy night, carefully, firmly, not because you're afraid of the rain, but because you've had enough of being cold. Elijah Monroe turned 10 years old this past January. He still has strong opinions about socks. He is, by multiple accounts, one of the most curious and thoughtful kids in his class, a child who asks his teacher follow-up questions and reads books above his grade level and still makes sure to visit Ruth every single week. Cassidy was promoted to operations manager at the hotel last spring, a title that comes with a real salary and real benefits and a small office with a window. Patricia Monroe received her kidney transplant 18 months ago and is, as of the most recent news, doing well and pushing through recovery with the same stubborn steadiness her daughter inherited. And on the windowsill of Cassidy's current apartment, larger now, on the second floor of a building that smells like nothing unpleasant, there is still a small plant. Not the original, which she eventually lost in a move. But another one, similar. Still alive. Still tended to. Because some habits are not about necessity. They're about identity. She is still standing. Which means, by Patricia Monroe's measure, she is still winning. And Marcus Webb? He is out there somewhere, living his life, driving his car, running his firm. No one who matters to this story is keeping track of him. That is perhaps the most fitting ending, not a dramatic confrontation, not a courtroom, not a tearful reconciliation. Just a woman crossing a street with her son's hand in hers, turning a corner, and not looking back. Just a man standing on a sidewalk with nothing to say. And everything between them, the love, the promise, the abandonment, the years, settling quietly into the past where it belongs. Here is what this story asks of you, if you're willing to sit with it. It asks you to consider the people in your life who have been left at the worst possible moment, who have had to build from zero with someone else's absence as the foundation. It asks you to think about what we call strength, and whether we actually honor it in the people who most deserve that word. And it asks you, if you had been Marcus Webb on that sidewalk, looking at a 7-year-old who has your jaw and your eyes, knowing what you chose and what it cost, would there be any words adequate to that moment? Or would you, like him, find that there are simply none? We would genuinely love to hear your thoughts on this. What did Cassidy's story make you feel? What would you have done differently, as her, or as him? Leave it in the comments. This community takes these conversations seriously, and so do we. And if this video moved you the way we hope it did, please share it with someone who needs to hear a story about what real strength actually looks like, not the loud, triumphant kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that keeps a plant alive on a windowsill and shows up for work and raises a child who asks good questions and makes handprint paintings for the woman who brought soup. That kind. Share it. It matters more than you know. If you're new to this channel, subscribe and stay close, because the stories we tell here are about real lives, real choices, and real consequences. And we are just getting started.